right, welcome. Thank you for attending this session. As I said, my name is Matthew Roos. I'll be presenting on my graduate thesis work from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, which was conducted alongside my advisor, Dr. H. Brian Underwood, from the USGS Eastern Ecological Science Center. And then we on the scale sensitivity of two habitat generalist species, the white-tailed deer and American black bear. So first we have to ask, what is scale? Scale influences any pattern detected in ecological mosaic and is bounded by two values: extent, which is the overall area encompassed by investigation or defining a landscape boundary, and then grain, which refers to the size of the individual units of observation in a study. Extent and grain define the upper and lower limits of resolution of a study, and any inferences about scale dependency have to be derived within those bounds. Scale is important to wildlife because they respond to landscape resources at multiple spatial scales, depending on the resource and their life history. And these spatial patterns vary with relevant environmental factors, such as what is accessible or available. Excuse me. This is all important to the study of landscape ecology, which is the understanding of how scale affects the measurement of heterogeneity and the scales at which spatial pattern is important for ecological phenomena. Oh, excuse me. One tool used in spatial ecology is point pattern analysis, which allows us to understand spatial patterns across spatial scales, a factor of which is scale sensitivity, or the clustering of point patterns at one or more spatial extents. A common application of this is hotspot identification, which is particularly relevant to wildlife vehicle collisions, which, as I'm sure many to all of you know, is a major cause of mortality for wildlife. But for our purposes, it is also a widely available type of data set that serves as a marked point pattern, or a point pattern that not only includes spatial variables such as the X and Y, but other information such as the number of animals, the sex, and the age of the animals. Challenges of using point pattern analysis in the case of wildlife vehicle collisions is that it can fall prey to non-visitation or non-detection bias, where collisions within a study area are not picked up either because that specific location was not surveyed at the time the collision had taken place, or they were simply not detected, they weren't reported for various reasons. As well, in GIS implementations of point pattern analysis, the use of subjective inputs is often required, such as the conceptualization of spatial relationships, the distance method, and the threshold distance. The overarching goal of our research was to demonstrate the value of point pattern analysis for detecting wildlife scale sensitivity. Our purpose was to generate a new workflow to identify potential road crossing corridors from land cover information alongside biologically relevant inputs, especially perception. And then our objectives were to construct a new workflow to identify wildlife road crossing locations and then validate our results. Our hypothesis was that landscape perception thresholds would be associated with the most highly resolved spatial extent at which clustering is pronounced. And we predict that locations of wildlife vehicle collision will show strong coincidence with functional connectivity at the road nexus. Our study areas and data sets primarily were for white-tailed deer, 1 year of wildlife vehicle collisions in Onondaga County, New York, alongside data sets of living deer information, track counts, and distance surveys. And then for black bear, they were 1 year of wildlife vehicle collisions in the mountain and coastal regions of North Carolina. One quadrat, one study area in the mountain region, and then 2 in the coastal region. Our intended applications are to evaluate the placement of treatments to mitigate wildlife vehicle collisions in landscapes with fragmented habitat. One type of treatment would be a wildlife crossing sign meant to control people or traffic. And another type would be an overpass or underpass or some kind of crossing meant to facilitate or control wildlife. The conventional workflow for placement of these treatments is frequently to identify hotspots in existing point pattern data and then place management solutions based on hotspots. But this varies. In some cases, visual assessment of collision locations or assumption of randomness is used. Our proposed workflow is when you have identified your target species, use a combination of incremental spatial autocorrelation and literature to identify a perceptual threshold or essentially a boundary of perceptual distance for the species, which you use to generate gap and spur ranges, a type of habitat measurement that we will get to, alongside suitability maps generated from land cover data and an assessment of the species' particular life requisites, which are plugged into an R script called FragPatch, developed by my advisor and some of his collaborators, to generate a map of the functional connectivity of a landscape, which you can overlay onto a road network. And where that functional connectivity intersects with the roadway, you can predict that wildlife may cross there. So you have to define the landscape perception thresholds for both species using incremental spatial autocorrelation and assessment of data and literature. You apply the distance thresholds alongside land cover-based suitability maps to determine the functional connectivity of the patch network and generate a scale-dependent connectivity map. So the tool we use for identifying that perceptual threshold is incremental spatial autocorrelation, which is a GIS tool that examines the autocorrelation of point pattern data sets with that marked additional information and the correlation of that information, and generates a series of z-scores across a distance range. And what we are particularly interested in is the earliest peak in that z-score, which indicates the shortest distance at which clustering is pronounced, which we determined would likely be the relevant perceptual distance of the species. The landscape perception thresholds are used to generate two values: a gap thickness, or the width of a strip of non-habitat that is perceived by the organism as part of a patch, such as a forest opening, and the spur width, which is the minimum width of habitat that an organism would still use as if it were habitat. So like an oasis, if it's too small, the organism doesn't know that it's habitat. These two values together make up your functional connectedness, and it's required that gap thickness is greater than spur width. So the R script that we use, FragPatch, uses two primary inputs: the suitability raster, where you take life requisites of your species. In our case, we focused on escape cover for deer and bear in our primary data sets. And then you generate ranges of gap and spur thresholds centered on that primary value you determined. You can extrapolate ranges of gap and spur values. And then through the range of gap and spur values, you iterate through the combinations. Essentially, for each gap value, along with each spur value, you repeat this process. So for each gap and spur combination, you determine the area of non-habitat within suitable cells. This is what FragPatch does, I shouldn't say you. Determine the area of non-habitat within suitable cells, first using the spur threshold, and then it repeats that using the gap threshold, and it's able to create a raster map from the reclassified habitat network. So this is incremented for each combination of gap and spur distance through the ranges. The raster map for each combination of gap and spur are layered, and then cells with habitat at all layers are considered to be core habitat patches, and then cells with habitat at some but not all layers were considered to be connectivity for our purposes. It's not core habitat, but it's some kind of habitat the organism will move through. We analyzed our outcomes by buffering the points of real vehicle collisions we had through a range of distance thresholds and determined the proportion of collisions with their buffers that intersect with our connectivity or patch maps at each buffer size or distance. We validated first by using a randomization procedure where we generated random points along roadways in the study areas equal to the number of real collisions, and essentially repeated that analysis process on the random points as if they were vehicle collision points. We repeated this for 500 data sets, and then we compared it against the real points to see if the 500 sets of random vehicle collisions aligned with habitat similarly to the real ones. This is an example of one buffer distance comparing both in the connectivity and patch maps, the random versus the real. That red line is the mean proportion of random points and their buffers that intersected with connectivity and patch. And then the black lines represent the 95 percentile range on either side to indicate statistical, significance. And then the blue line indicates the proportion of real vehicle collisions that intersected with connectivity or patch at that range. So when the blue line is within the black lines, it is not statistically significantly different. But when the blue line is outside the black lines, it is significantly different. Also for validation, we utilized a new data set of deer vehicle collision points on Staten Island. as well as we used an alternate life requisite model for one of our bear vehicle collision study areas, where instead of just escape cover, we utilized both food and cover to kind of test a couple different variations on this. So the incremental spatial autocorrelation for white-tailed deer gave us a threshold value, perceptual threshold of 240 meters, which we confirmed using literature analysis. And then for American black bear, the wildlife vehicle collisions were not dense enough to really produce usable incremental spatial autocorrelation data. So we used our white-tailed deer incremental spatial autocorrelation alongside literature indicating the way that perceptual thresholds scale among organisms with relatively similar body types or life histories to generate a 580-meter perceptual threshold for American black bear. This is the incremental spatial autocorrelation for our live deer data sets, those track counts and distance samplings. You can see that the first or one of the first peaks in those z-scores is right around that 200-meter mark or a little above. And then the same thing occurred in our Onondaga County deer vehicle collision data set. That first peak in the z-scores right at that 200 mark. These were the maps generated by FragPatch, but first we had our GIS land cover map, which using the land cover type suitable to escape cover, we generated a suitability map through GIS. And then FragPatch generated a functional patch map. So you can see in Onondaga County there, patches are fairly distinct. They're scattered throughout the landscape, but they're also large enough to be like concrete blocks in and of themselves. This is our North Carolina mountain region quadrat. You can see also some pretty strong patches showing up, and then the areas where there aren't patches are pretty clearly based around those developed areas. And then this was one of our coastal region quadrats. Both of the coastal region quadrats in the initial escape cover based data generate pretty diffuse patches. And then this is deer vehicle collision locations overlaid on patch and then connectivity. And we're really more concerned about connectivity here because that's where wildlife are moving through. And connectivity does not exist in the same place as patches, but is essentially in between it. So the outcome of that statistical significance difference is that, interestingly, the random points were more correlated with the patch areas than the real points, but more along the lines of what we were expecting. The real points were statistically significantly more correlated with connectivity than the random points. That blue background to the graph indicates where the difference between the real and the random are statistically significant. And then this is your North Carolina Quadrangle 11 mountain region. Some pretty strong patches, but the connectivity was a little bit more diffuse than Onondaga County. But you can see that although there wasn't statistical difference in the patches, the Quadrat 11 connectivity was statistically significantly different. Essentially, the real points were more correlated with connectivity than the random points for several of the distance classes. And then Quadrangle 16, our example coastal region, was very diffuse, not really anything specific happening in any one location, and there wasn't nothing really showed up in the patch or the connectivity statistical significance. For our Staten Island data, deer vehicle collisions, there was an even stronger statistically significant difference in the real points than there was in the Onondaga County. We think that maybe because, thank you, on Staten Island, the roadways are even more interwoven with the patch and connectivity zones, especially the patch zones. Remember, on Onondaga County, the patch real point relationship was essentially flipped. In this case, it's very much along the lines of what we would be expecting. And then for quadrant 16, when we switched to, that was the very diffuse one, remember, when we switched from escape cover to escape cover and food, a relationship actually did develop where there was a statistically significant difference and the real points were more correlated to habitat than the random points. So from this, it seems likely that incremental autocorrelation can elucidate the scale sensitivity of wildlife through both using both perceptual threshold and suitable habitat. But deer versus bear are two test species in this example seem to have a different relationship to the landscape, and determining that relationship to the landscape is going to be important to applying this forward. And then habitat dynamics also seem to vary by region, where the amount of connectivity or patches, or how diffuse it is, or whether like in the mountain versus coastal regions of North Carolina, there's different kinds of agriculture, may all play an effect. So for applicability, we propose this is less sensitive to bias over short spatial extents than using subjective inputs. Incremental spatial autocorrelation is novel and more objective than the conventional workflow that determining the objective perceptual threshold of the species. And we believe it may be scalable. Axial eye length, eye size, and visual acuity are allometrically scaled in vertebrates, which keys into their landscape perception threshold. However, when it gets down to like amphibians, which this would be very interesting use for, you need extremely high resolution land cover data to create the same effect, which may be hard to come by. Thank you. Where connectivity is sufficiently distinct, specific locations of likely wildlife road crossings can be identified and mitigated. So in specific cases where the connectivity looks in a way that is well defined, where patches are indistinct and connectivity is diffuse, mitigation efforts are more likely to be costly or ineffective. Suitability and resultant patch delineation vary depending on life requisite chosen, and experimentation with multiple life requisites is advised. I would like to acknowledge my graduate committee for their interest and guidance, Dr. Andrew J. Sanchez-Matador for porting our functions into Terra R, Dr. Joseph Folta from North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission for all matters relating to bears, New York City Parks Commission, Onondaga County Sheriff's Department for providing us wildlife vehicle collision data. And then I would also like to thank AASHTO for sponsoring me to come here. Thank you.
We'll take questions, and if I could ask you to please repeat the question so that our online listeners can hear them. Questions from the audience?
Yes.
You probably explained this and I just missed it, but why wouldn't you flip it and not look at escape cover, but look for forage, as if they're moving for forage rather than escape cover?
So we did focus on escape cover primarily based on my advisor's past experience and some literature review. I think an avenue for future study would be to flip it in more cases than just that one bear quadrant and examine more life requisites. And I think if this were to be, I'm sorry, I should repeat the question. It was asked why we did not, for most of the data sets, flip it and test food as well, besides just escape cover. I think if you were going to apply this, you would want to experiment with different life requisites depending on your species to try and determine how it would best be applied in that case.
And maybe one really quick question.
I think we had black.
Well, I don't know if it's super quick and maybe I can bring it up. Could you revisit how you got from spatial autocorrelation to perception distances and thresholds in the species?
Yes. So in our case, the incremental spatial autocorrelation indicated the shortest distance at which these animals were grouping or clustering. And then from there, that kind of, based on my advisor's past research and some previous literature, that seems to correlate with their perceptual distance. The question was, how did we get from incremental spatial autocorrelation to perceptual distance?
All right, thank you very much.